The dust rose in choking clouds, mingling with the fervent prayers and the jingle of ill-fitted armor, as a desperate throng marched across the parched plains of southern France. Amongst them, a small, weary figure, perhaps no more than 7 years old, trudged along, his small hand lost in the grasp of an adult stranger, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewildered faith. This was the Children's Crusade of 1212, a tragic, deluded pilgrimage, and this child was one of its forgotten victims, lured by promises of divine protection and an effortless victory against hardened warriors. He was just a boy, yet he was condemned to a grueling journey that would lead not to salvation, but to slavery or death. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover the horrifying truth about this forgotten chapter of history, a chilling testament to misguided zeal and the exploitation of innocence evidence that chroniclers of the time often glorified, viewing it as a miracle or a divine judgment, rather than the monstrous human tragedy it truly was. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. This wasn't some isolated ancient practice from distant lands. This was Europe. This was the heart of Christian faith. This was an era of profound religious fervor and unquestioning obedience, and what I'm about to reveal will completely shatter your understanding of how mass delusion, fueled by charismatic figures and desperation, could consume an entire generation and sacrifice its most vulnerable members. The summer of 1212 saw a phenomenon sweep through parts of France and Germany, the Children's Crusade. It began with the emergence of a charismatic figure, a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes, who claimed to have received a letter from Jesus Christ himself, commissioning him to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. One he preached that pure hearts and innocent souls, unburdened by sin, would achieve what hardened knights had failed to do: reclaim Jerusalem. His message resonated deeply with a populace exhausted by repeated, failed adult crusades, plagued by poverty and yearning for divine intervention. Imagine the desperation: the fields ravaged by famine, the towns struggling under oppressive feudal lords, the deep-seated belief in miracles as the only escape from suffering. Thousands, primarily impoverished peasants, but significantly, a vast number of children, abandoned their homes and families to follow Stephen. 2. They were not seen as vulnerable, but as divinely chosen instruments, their purity a weapon more potent than any sword. Think about that for a moment. While your biggest worry at 7 might have been chores or avoiding scoldings, these children were embarking on a journey of hundreds of miles, exposed to the elements, to hunger, to disease, driven by a faith they barely understood but implicitly trusted. Their futures weren't about growing up in their villages. They were about marching towards a distant, unknown destiny, a promised land of salvation that would never materialize. But to understand how such widespread delusion could sweep up so many innocents, we need to expose the rotting core of a society yearning for a miraculous escape from its grim realities. This crusade hadn't always targeted children with such intensity. Previous crusades had been military expeditions, costly ventures for knights and professional soldiers. 3. But Stephen's message, echoed by a similar movement in Germany led by Nicholas of Cologne, specifically appealed to the young and the poor, promising that the seas would part for them, that God would provide. 4. The fervour spread like wildfire. Prince-bishoprics and secular lords alike, caught between skepticism and fear of opposing what some believed was a divinely inspired movement, allowed the children to leave. Thousands gathered, driven by a mix of genuine piety, youthful adventure, and a desperate hope for a better life. Wait, it gets worse. The contemporary records, often written by monks and chroniclers who were either swept up in the religious zeal or carefully recorded events from afar, describe the phenomenon with a chilling mixture of awe and detachment. While they noted the vast numbers of children, they offered little in the way of critical analysis or compassionate concern for their fate. They saw it as a spiritual test, or a sign of the times. This was the terrifying environment in which these children found themselves. Their innocence, far from being a shield, made them the perfect, pliable instruments for a deluded crusade. This was the brutal reality of a society consumed by a desperate, often irrational faith, where faith itself was twisted into justification for unimaginable suffering. The villages and towns of France and Germany, far from being havens of community, became centers of recruitment and fervent farewells. Families, often living on the brink of starvation, paradoxically saw hope in their children joining this holy mission. Neighbor watched as neighbor's child departed, fueled by a collective delusion that God would surely protect them. Accusations of trickery against the leaders were rare, dismissed by the overwhelming belief in a miracle. Doubt was swiftly condemned as a lack of faith. Children in such times didn't play freely. They were often molded by the intense religious atmosphere, their minds receptive to divine promises. Many children, terrifyingly, joined without their parents' permission, or were willingly sent by families too poor to feed them. The 7-year-old boy, like countless others, would have learned the subtle, terrifying cues of fervent religious revival before he learned the full duties of childhood. The electrifying speeches of Stephen, the joyous singing of hymns, the overwhelming sense of shared purpose that masked the impending doom. He was a child caught in a world of adult desperation and delusion, suddenly stripped of the stability and care he should have been afforded by his community. His innocence eroding day by day under the pressure of an unfolding tragedy he could not possibly control or comprehend. His education in this journey became a cruel, real-time lesson in false hope and agonizing privation. But here's the detail historians don't want you to know. Meticulous but scattered accounts, from monastic chronicles and papal letters, exist, hinting at the true, grim end of this tragic procession. These records confirm that thousands of children perished along the route, from starvation, exposure, and disease. 5. Others were sold into slavery. 6. This wasn't merely an unfortunate consequence of a difficult journey, it was a systematic disintegration, a public, horrifying sacrifice of innocence that was largely unacknowledged as such by those in power. Even their pure intentions, which should have protected them, were rendered meaningless against the harsh realities of the medieval world. Their brief taste of childhood was merely a cruel preparation for this ultimate public extermination. This act was a chilling testament to the lengths that misplaced faith and desperate hope would go, fundamentally undermining the very concept of divine protection when it clashed with human vulnerability. It was a spiritual assassination of their right to a safe, happy childhood. In the grip of this feverish period, the process of recruitment and journey was swift and merciless. Once the message resonated, children and youths, sometimes accompanied by a few desperate adults, set out. Imagine these young children, innocent and bewildered, facing hardened roads, treacherous mountains, and the scorching sun, their initial zeal slowly replaced by gnawing hunger and exhaustion. They were urged to keep marching, their faith tested with every blister and empty stomach. Records from various sources describe their arduous journey, some attempting to cross the Alps, perishing in the harsh conditions, others marching south towards the Mediterranean, believing the sea would part for them, only to find an unyielding horizon. These were not willing treks, they were the desperate marches of deluded innocence. The goals were clear, though veiled in pious pronouncements: to reclaim Jerusalem, to prove the power of pure faith, and in doing so, to achieve a spiritual triumph that adults had failed to deliver. Every step, every prayer, fueled the march, adding to the growing toll of suffering. The mechanics of this crusade are where this story turns from religious fervor to truly monstrous. Imagine these charismatic leaders, themselves perhaps deluded, systematically driving thousands of innocents towards an impossible goal. The children were isolated from practical realities, claimed to be for their purification and direct connection to God, but in reality, to maximize their susceptibility to the leaders' messages. They were encouraged to believe in impossible acts that God would provide food, that the seas would open. The very illogicality of these promises, so clear to us now, was seen as proof of divine intervention then. The more impossible the promise, the more miraculous it seemed. They were talking about the systematic dehumanization of children, Mass delusion, religiously sanctioned exploitation, executed with cynical precision. Every step was deliberate, every promise a poisoned lure aimed directly at the children's souls and, ultimately, their lives. The final betrayal was struck not in a single act of judgment, but in the relentless progression of this doomed march. The 7-year-old boy, like thousands before and beside him, would have simply succumbed. He was now trapped, not by chains, but by exhaustion, hunger, and disease, his innocence obliterated by a tragic, collective delusion. This was a triumph of naive faith over any semblance of reason, morality, or basic human care. The ramifications of this widespread tragedy, the loss of entire generations of youth from villages, the profound disillusionment among survivors, the dark stain on the concept of spiritual warfare would haunt Europe for centuries. The dark shadow of such horrors casts a long, chilling pall over any romanticized view of religious crusades. But they saved the cruelest detail for last. These children did not find salvation in the Holy Land. They found suffering and oblivion. Many died along the arduous route, their small bodies succumbing to the harsh elements, starvation, and rampant diseases like dysentery, their graves unmarked, forgotten in foreign lands. 7 others, reaching the Mediterranean ports of Marseille and Genoa, found no parting seas. 8. Instead, opportunistic merchants and slave traders, seeing their immense vulnerability, offered them passage, only to betray them, selling them into slavery in North Africa or the Middle East. 9. Their small bodies were sold as commodities, their innocence betrayed, their desperate hopes shattered by the cruelest of realities. They were simply removed from life as free individuals, their disappearance a chilling testament to the power of human avarice and deliberate exploitation. 10. Their lives were consumed by hardship and betrayal, their cries swallowed by the vast indifference of the world. What were their last moments like, those sold into slavery? The right to their freedom, their names, their very existence, were all stripped away. They were consigned to oblivion by human greed and the chilling silence of a complicit world. This wasn't just about pursuing a holy war. It was about eradicating lives so completely that they left no trace, no justice, no reckoning. It was about turning a blind eye to monstrous suffering. The very concept of divine protection, of human sanctity, was utterly obliterated in the face of such relentless, all-consuming delusion and exploitation. When the 7-year-old boy, if he survived the march to the coast, found himself on a ship, perhaps initially believing it was sailing for Jerusalem, he would have soon realized the horrifying truth. He was a child, clinging to the fading hope of deliverance, a last glimmer of light in the deepening shadows of the hold. Can you imagine the bewildered confusion as the vessel sailed not east but south? The horrified stares of children around him, realizing their shared doom. The endless, agonizing journey across the sea, replaced by absolute visceral terror and the grim reality of forced servitude. He was surrounded by the grim confines of the ship, its stench, its despair, yet isolated by the terrifying, universal condemnation of his fate. His questions, if he could voice them through his terror-choked throat, might have been simple. About his family, about their village, perhaps even why God had abandoned them. The answers, veiled in shouts of orders and the crackle of a whip, would have ultimately been cruel, final, and utterly incomprehensible to his dying hope. The leadership behind the Crusade, particularly Stephen of Cloyes, vanished from the historical record after the debacle, their fate often as unknown as their followers. While no lavish preparations for the children themselves occurred, the very fabric of the movement pulsed with the fervent, almost insane energy of a religious revival. Every sermon, every public gathering, every new recruit was designed to legitimize the pilgrimage, to erase any doubt about its divine inspiration. The very air pulsed with the chilling urgency of a sacred crusade, a stark contrast to the quiet, unimaginable terror of the innocent victims. No one wrote verses of sorrow, no elegies were composed for the children now condemned to hardship and slavery. The sheer spectacle of their march served as a powerful, chilling display of religious zeal and absolute collective delusion, a performance designed to inspire and intimidate, rather than to serve true justice or compassion. Every recruit, every step taken, every life extinguished was presented as a symbol of humanity's piety, a brutal position attained at the ultimate cost of countless innocent lives. In those grim years, the roads of Europe became a macabre procession route, the air heavy with the dust of thousands of marching feet and the silent cries of the suffering. The children, along with other victims, were seen less and less frequently, their faces replaced by new recruits. Their very existence became a dangerous, forbidden topic for discussion, a name whispered only in the darkest corners of homes. They were curiosities no longer, but horrifying examples, a permanent scar on the communal memory. Their days on the road would have been strictly monotonous, filled with quiet despair, their only companions perhaps each other, or the hardened, unsympathetic adults. Their lessons, if they had any, would have ceased, replaced by the grim reality of their march and the horrifying anticipation of their doom. They were taught nothing but the bitter lesson of human cruelty and the unforgiving nature of mass delusion. The physical toll must have been immense as well. Children, especially when subjected to such arduous journeys, are prone to illness, malnutrition, and profound psychological breakdown. Did they grow weak? Did they hallucinate from hunger? Did they call for their mothers in the dead of night? These heartbreaking questions linger in the void of definitive answers, lost to the deliberate silence of the records. I've got 3 more shocking revelations coming up about how mass delusion consumed children in other historical tragedies. But before we continue, if you're finding this hidden history as disturbing as I did when I uncovered it, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. I release new investigations every week, exposing the dark truths about historical figures. And trust me, the Children's Crusade is just the beginning of what the history books don't want you to know. No one mentioned their increasing frailty, their probable fear, or their desperate pleas for mercy, for a moment of human kindness. Their leaders, driven by zeal or perhaps pure deception, would have observed their slow decline, their fading hopes, utterly unmoved by their suffering. The chroniclers deliberately silenced any murmurs of doubt, cultivating a narrative of righteous pilgrimage, a chilling, dehumanizing narrative, as if these children had simply ceased to be human beings and were, indeed, divinely protected symbols. Official records became blank where their innocence should have been, purged of any reference to their true nature, their brief lives. Any whisper of their suffering, any inquiry into the justice of their fate, was considered a lack of faith, a dangerous challenge to the very foundation of the Crusade. This deliberate lack of compassion, this systematic dehumanization, is perhaps the most damning evidence of all, speaking volumes about the depravity of mass delusion. Meanwhile, the saga continued, but it was fraught with internal and external pressures. The sheer scale of the march, the inclusion of thousands of children, began to breed deep unease, even among some of the initially supportive clergy. Rumors circulated. Was this truly divine will, or something far more sinister and out of control? These questions became a persistent, poisonous thorn in the side of the authorities, a silent condemnation that no amount of fervent preaching could truly silence. Their parents, if they survived the purges of subsequent famines or wars, undoubtedly lived in agony, their very existence a testament to the missing innocence, desperate for understanding, for an end to the terror, for a moment of peace. Their grief, a private torment, was a testament to the public horror, a constant reminder of the human cost of fanaticism, a wound that would never truly heal. The constant anxiety and uncertainty must have weighed heavily on the entire region until the craze finally exhausted itself, its fury spent, its promise broken. Then, around 1213, the fate of the Children's Crusade became tragically clear. The majority perished on the roads or were sold into slavery. There are no records of apologies, no monuments to the executed or enslaved children, no public mourning for the vast majority. They simply vanished into the brutal history, their lives consumed by hardship and betrayal. 11. The most widely accepted truth is that they were indeed marched to their deaths, or to a life worse than death, their lives extinguished in a horrific display of communal delusion and exploitation. Their bodies, if they died on the march, were unceremoniously buried in shallow graves. If enslaved, they lived and died in anonymity far from home. Their young lives, caught in the grip of irrational faith, were swallowed by the machinations of hysteria and avarice. This deliberate act of erasure ensured their story would forever be a haunting question, a dark stain on the tapestry of European history, a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for self-inflicted terror. Their disappearance, at such a tender age, highlights the sheer ruthlessness of a society consumed by irrational faith, an era where charismatic claims superseded all reason, where desperation was held by any means necessary, and where the most vulnerable paid the ultimate price. The lack of compassionate records, the calculated silence, the pervasive terror, all reveal a desperate attempt to maintain ideological purity through sacrifice and to enforce a rigid, unforgiving narrative. Their lives were an accusation against the darkness of the age, their deaths a terrifying convenience, their only legacy a chilling warning from history etched in the collective consciousness. The 7-year-old boy and countless other children in the Children's Crusade were murdered, not with a sword or poison in private, but with false promise and the relentless march of collective delusion. Not in a day, but across weeks and months of systematic privation and horrifying public spectacle. Their childhoods were murdered by fanaticism, their innocence by impossible dreams, their very existence by a desperate need for a miracle. They left behind no progeny, only a haunting question that resonated for centuries, a dark cloud hanging over the human conscience. The cycle of faith-driven violence, where children became expendable pawns, continued because that's what cycles do when no one stops them. But we can stop romanticizing these dark chapters. We can call them what they were: child victims of misguided zeal, innocent human beings sacrificed for the convenience of ideology and desperation, the utter destruction of purity in the name of a twisted faith. 12. The next time someone tells you about the grand narratives of European history, about the supposed glory of the Crusades, tell them about the forgotten children of 1212. Tell them about the 7-year-old boy marched to his death. Tell them about the silence that swallowed thousands of young lives whole, erasing them from the historical record. Tell them about the enduring horror of mass delusion and ultimate betrayal. That's the real Children's Crusade. That's the truth behind the pious proclamations and the fervent marches. That's the horror we've spent centuries trying to forget, to gloss over, to explain away with convenient fictions. But these children deserve to be remembered, not just as numbers in a grim tally, but as human beings who should have been protected and weren't, as innocents who should have lived and were instead sacrificed, as lives extinguished before they truly began, their potential utterly obliterated. Their names, often lost to history, should be remembered. Victims of a world that saw children as vulnerable targets for its grandest, most dangerous delusions. One was 7 years old, a child crusader, and nobody saved him. That's the horror that should haunt us, not ghosts or monsters or things that go bump in the night, but the real horror of real people doing unconscionable things and calling it divine will, calling it necessity. The children of the Crusade, remember their names, remember their story, and remember that the only thing necessary for such evil to flourish is for good people to look away and call it history. The young lives consumed by fanaticism deserve at least that much. If the story of the Children's Crusade shocked you, you need to see what happened to other young figures caught in the ruthless grip of mass delusion. I've uncovered more suppressed historical truths. Subscribe for more investigations, and I'll see you in the next one.